In a split-second decision, with all the energy she could summon, Vivian kicked him in his crotch and bolted for the door. "Ah! Vivian, you crazy bitch!" Michael shouted in pain, raising the gun as she yanked the door open and sprinted into the hallway. The driver's window rolled down, and a man's voice called out urgently, "Vivian, get in!" She turned, her eyes wide with disbelief. She recognized him. The man from earlier at Pier 39, the one in the wheelchair, was right there, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Get in now," he repeated with a louder tone. Vivian hesitated for a split second. From the corner of her eye, she saw Michael emerge from the house, running toward her, gun still in hand. Without another thought, she yanked open the car door and jumped inside. "Go!" she screamed. And the man stepped on the gas, speeding away as Michael's figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror. The car sped through the darkened streets, the city lights flashing by in a blur. Vivian's heart pounded, her pulse still racing from the encounter with Michael. She stole a glance at the man in the driver's seat. His expression hardened with focus, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I slashed your tires," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. Vivian's eyes widened in panic. Was she in even deeper trouble with this stranger? Before she could say a word, he continued, "Your car has a tracker. Michael will find you, no matter how far you go. That's why he always seems to know where you are. Haven't you wondered how he shows up everywhere?" "Who are you?" Vivian demanded, her voice shaky. "Why are you helping me?" He stayed silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like stone, hardened by years of wear. "I'm Daniel." After a brief pause, he glanced at her and added, "I used to be like Jason. A long time ago. They messed me up real bad. But I managed to break free before they could finish the job. Barely." "So you know what they've done to Jason? You know about the chip?" "I do. I've been under the radar for years. Not even the profilers could find me, but somehow, Jason did. We were supposed to meet at the pier tonight, but he didn't show. When the bomb went off, I knew why." He looked her way briefly before continuing. "Jason is running out of time. The good thing is, he's a strong man. Not everyone has resisted for as long as he has, but it's also making the profilers step up their game." "What do you mean?" Vivian asked, her voice cracking from the stress of the entire day. That bomb was not supposed to go off. Jason had tried to maneuver the wiring, but I guess they figured it out and still had him set it off. He got hurt in the process. He's unconscious right now, but we need to reach him before they do and stop the mind control. Vivian's breath caught. "How do we stop it?" Daniel was silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. "That chip needs to come out of Jason. It's the only way to free him. But it's dangerous, and we need to act fast." "How do I know I can trust you? And how do you know so much?" she asked with a trembling voice. Daniel exhaled deeply, his expression darkening. "I used to have a chip too. Mine was in my arm. It didn't control my mind like Jason's, but it controlled my body. They restricted my movements, forced me to carry out tasks I didn't want to. My own muscles betrayed me, but I was aware the whole time." Vivian's eyes widened. You were controlled like Jason? Yes, but not as bad. It took me years to break free, and even then, I'm not the same. The chip was removed, but the damage was done. My muscles, especially my arm where they placed it, were never the same. The recovery was slow, but I survived. It was the old tech, though. He glanced at her, eyes narrowing. Now they're implanting it behind the ear. It's far worse. Jason's in more danger than I ever was. Vivian's heart pounded. So there's no way to break the control once they've placed it there? She asked, desperation lacing her voice. Not like it was for me, Daniel said, shaking his head. Back then, they could only mess with my body, but now they own every part of you. Jason's been resisting, but it's only a matter of time before he's completely gone. We need to act quickly, or we'll lose him. Daniel took a deep breath. The bomb that went off tonight, it wasn't random. It was a cover-up. The profilers stole years of research and hard work after conducting secret experiments they didn't want anyone finding out about. They blew up the company's main office to erase all traces of their theft. Vivian stared at him, her heart thudding in her chest. A cover-up. What kind of research are we talking about? The kind that involves mind control, behavior modification, and advanced implants. The same tech they used on Jason, Daniel said grimly. They couldn't let anyone trace it back to them, so they blew it all up. Where are you taking me? She asked, realizing they were heading toward the outskirts of the city. We need to get off the grid. There's a safe house not far from here. We can regroup, figure out our next steps. They pulled into a dimly lit alley, and Daniel killed the engine. We're here, he said softly. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest as she followed him toward a small, rundown building. She felt like she was walking into the unknown. As they reached the door, Daniel turned to her. You need to be prepared for what you're about to see. Jason's in bad shape, but we can't stay here long. Michael will be looking for you, and we don't have much time. Vivian nodded. She didn't know if she was ready for this, but she had no choice. Jason needed her, and she wasn't about to let him face this alone. Daniel pushed open the door, and as they stepped inside, the faint sound of labored breathing reached her ears. Her heart clenched painfully as she saw Jason lying on a makeshift bed, his face pale and bruised, his body covered in burns and cuts. Tears welled in her eyes as she rushed to his side, gently taking his hand. Jason, she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, his eyes met hers. Vivian, he rasped, his voice weak. I'm here, she said, choking back a sob. Jason's lips curled into the faintest smile before his eyes closed again. Vivian's heart ached, but she knew they couldn't stay. She turned to Daniel. We need to get him out of here. And then, we end this. For days, they drove from place to place, trying to evade being found because even though Vivian's car was no longer a tracking tool, the chip in Jason's head was a tracker as well. While Daniel drove, Vivian, with the hidden messages Jason had given her, was able to track the doctor who had initially inserted the chip in Jason's head, Dr. Haynes. He used to be a neurosurgeon who got greedy and decided to work with the bad guys to get triple his yearly income. Their only hope was to find this man and somehow get him to remove the device before Jason's mind was completely lost. Are you sure he'll be there? Vivian asked, her voice trembling with desperation. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. He has to be. He's the only one who knows how to reverse this. The car sped through the quiet streets until they pulled up in front of a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city. The place looked abandoned with boarded-up windows and a faded sign that once read, Haynes Medical Research. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the door. Daniel banged on it, the sound echoing into the silent night. After what felt like an eternity, there was a sound from inside. Footsteps, and then the door creaked open, revealing a frail older man with unkempt hair and wild eyes. He looked nervously from Daniel to Vivian. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked. "We need your help," Daniel said firmly, stepping forward. "It's about Jason. You implanted a chip in his head for the profilers, and we need you to take it out now." Dr. Haynes paled at the mention of the profilers. He shook his head, backing away from the door. No, I can't. You don't understand. It's too dangerous. I could never." Vivian stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "You don't have a choice. If you don't help us, Jason will die." The doctor hesitated, looking at Vivian with a mixture of fear and pity. The chip, it wasn't designed to be removed. It's embedded deep in the neural pathways. If I try to take it out, there's a high chance it could cause permanent brain damage, even paralysis. Or it could kill him. Vivian's stomach lurched. She glanced back at Daniel, who was watching her with tense eyes. They both knew the risk, but they didn't have a choice. Jason's life, or what was left of it, depended on this. "Do it," Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible. "Whatever happens, we have to try." Dr. Haynes swallowed hard, clearly terrified, but nodded reluctantly. "All right, bring him in." Dr. Haynes stood at the side, preparing his tools. His hands shook as he set up a small surgical kit. Scalpels, tweezers, a neurosurgical probe. He looked at Vivian and Daniel. The gravity of what he was about to do written all over his face. "Once I start, there's no going back," he said, voice wavering. "You need to know that." Vivian bit her lip, gripping Jason's hand tighter. "We're ready." With a deep breath, Dr. Haynes began. He carefully made an incision behind Jason's ear, the same place where the original chip had been inserted. Vivian winced as she watched. They were all on edge, knowing the profilers or Michael could find them at any moment. As Dr. Haynes inserted a small probe into the incision, Jason's body suddenly twitched violently. His eyes snapped open, wide with pain and confusion. He gasped, his body thrashing on the gurney. "Hold him down!" Dr. Haynes shouted. Jason's breathing was ragged, his muscles convulsing as the probe reached deeper into his brain. Dr. Haynes frowned, the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "It's not responding. The chip isn't releasing," he muttered under his breath. "I don't know if I can..." Suddenly, Jason let out a pained scream, his body bucking against the restraints. His eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment, Vivian thought they had lost him. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Then, just as quickly as it had started, Jason's body went limp. His breathing steadied, and the tension in his muscles relaxed. Dr. Haynes exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as he carefully withdrew the probe and the tiny chip from Jason's brain. "It's out," he said, his voice filled with relief. "It's over." Hours later, Jason woke up in a small, safe house. his head bandaged but free of the chip that had once controlled him. He blinked groggily, looking around the room, and his eyes landed on Vivian, who sat beside him, her hand still clutching his. "Vivian," he whispered. She leaned down, kissing his hand, tears of relief filling her eyes. "You're okay. You're free." Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. "We got the chip out. Haynes says you'll make a full recovery." Jason groaned, trying to sit up, wincing at the pain in his head. "And the profilers?" "Not for long," Daniel said. "We leaked everything. Documents, research, evidence of their mind control experiments. The press is all over it. The profilers are being torn apart publicly, and the authorities are finally looking into them. We won, Jason." Vivian nodded, her eyes bright with hope. "It's over. We stopped them." Jason looked at her, his eyes softening. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "Vivian, I don't know what I would have done without you." She leaned into him, and before she could respond, Jason gently cupped her face in his hands. "I love you," he whispered. Vivian's breath caught, and she threw her arms around him, their lips meeting in a passionate, tearful kiss. It felt like the world around them had melted away, and for the first time in months, everything seemed right. Months passed, and life was slowly settling into a new normal. One evening, Jason surprised Vivian with a beautiful bouquet of roses, inviting her over for a cozy dinner at his place. That night, he prepared a delicious pot of jollof rice, the best he'd ever made. As they ate, they laughed over the silliest things, sharing more kisses than either could keep count of. The warmth between them grew with every glance and every touch. A few hours later, Daniel joined them, bringing along his usual charm and a bottle of wine. Together, they drank to their heart's content, talking about the future and dreaming up ways to leave the past behind and start fresh. Jason took a moment to look at Vivian, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "There's no future I can imagine without you, Viv. You've given me a reason to live again, to hope again." He pulled her close, brushing his fingers gently along her cheek. "I love you." Their lips met in a tender kiss, and Daniel couldn't resist teasing them. "All right, you two? Save some for later," he joked, raising his glass. Vivian kissed him back, ignoring the third wheel in their midst. But as their kiss deepened, Jason suddenly pulled away, his face twisting in pain. His eyes darkened, and before Vivian could react, he stood up violently, grabbing her by the throat. "Jason!" Vivian gasped, her hands clawing at his grip, struggling to breathe. His face was contorted, his eyes filled with a terrifying emptiness, void of the love he had shown just moments before. Daniel rushed forward, grabbing Jason's arm and trying to pull him off Vivian. "What the hell are you doing?" Jason shoved Daniel with such force that he flew across the room, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Vivian's vision blurred as she tried to make sense of what was happening. They had removed the chip. How could this be happening? Suddenly, Jason's grip loosened and he released her, dropping her to the floor. Vivian coughed violently, gasping for air, her body shaking with fear. But Jason wasn't done. He grabbed her by the arm, dragging her toward the door. "Jason, stop!" she pleaded, her voice hoarse. "It's me, Vivian!" His face remained cold, unresponsive. His movements were mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Daniel struggled to his feet, trying to stop Jason, but before he could intervene, the screech of tires outside made them freeze. The door burst open, and Michael stood there smirking. "I see the activation worked perfectly," he said, nodding at Jason. Michael pointed at the trunk of the car. "Put her in there." Jason obeyed without hesitation, tossing Vivian inside like she was a rag doll. She hit the metal with a sharp cry of pain. "Jason!" she screamed again, tears streaming down her face as the trunk slammed shut. The drive to the profilist's facility was a blur of pain and terror. Vivian's mind raced, trying to figure out how Jason could still be controlled after the chip was removed. There had to be something more, a deeper layer of control that they hadn't uncovered. At the facility, she was dragged inside. They led her to a sterile lab where they forced her into a chair. "Give us the formula," Michael demanded, pacing in front of her. "What formula?" Vivian asked, confused at what was going on. "Vivian, don't be stupid now." Michael was growing impatient. "I don't know what you're talking about, really," she cried out. Michael's face twisted with anger. "Don't lie to me. The drug you've been developing? Give it to us, or I'll have Jason start shooting pieces of you off one by one." "A drug? My formula? But how could they even know about it when it was still in the trial phase, and the formula wasn't complete yet?" "Oh no." Vivian's heart sank as the realization hit her. Michael had been planted in her life to steal her research on the neuroregenerative drug she'd been developing to aid patients with memory loss. Now, the profilers wanted to twist her work, using it as a foundation to enhance their mind control methods. Jason stood next to her, expressionless. Vivian's heart broke as she looked into his cold, lifeless eyes. The man she loved was gone, and in his place stood a weapon. "I'm not giving you anything," she spat through clenched teeth. Michael's smile twisted into a cold sneer. "Jason, in the arm. Actually, wait. On second thought, if you're injured, you won't be able to write down the formula. I have a much better plan." He signaled to the guards, who disappeared briefly and then returned, dragging someone behind them. Vivian's heart lurched as Jessica appeared, battered but alive. She tried to rush toward her friend, but the guards held her back firmly. Michael's gaze sharpened. "I'll ask one last time, Vivian. Write the formula, or Jason pulls the trigger." Vivian's hands trembled, but she still hesitated, eyes darting from Jessica to Jason. In a swift motion, Michael nodded, and Jason's fired. The shot rang out, the bullet tearing into Jessica's shoulder. She cried out in pain, clutching her arm as blood seeped between her fingers. Eventually, weakened and terrified, she relented. She scribbled down what she believed to be the final formula, tears blurring her vision. "You're all cowards," she hissed, glaring at Michael. "This drug was supposed to help people, and you're using it to enslave them." Michael snatched the paper from her hand, his smile widening. "Thank you for your cooperation." He turned to Jason. "Now them." As Jason raised the gun, there was a sudden crash from the back exit. Guards rushed toward the noise, distracted by the commotion. Vivian barely registered the distraction when Daniel burst through the door, taking down the guards with swift, brutal efficiency. Vivian's heart surged with hope as Daniel fought his way to her. But before he could reach her, Michael stepped in, grabbing her by the neck. "Stay back," he yelled, his gun pressed to her temple. Daniel froze, glaring at Michael with hatred in his eyes. But Michael's smirk remained confident and unfazed. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Michael said, tightening his grip on Vivian. "There's another chip inside Jason, a failsafe. If you don't stop, I'll detonate it, and his brain will explode." Jason suddenly winced, his hands gripping his head as if fighting an internal war. Vivian looked into his eyes, begging for the man she loved to come back to her. "Jason, look at me, please." He hesitated, his grip on the gun shaking. Something flickered in his eyes, something familiar. Her scent, her presence. It was breaking through the haze, stirring memories deep inside him. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice cracking. But Michael sneered. "It's too late. The chip will detonate any second. Say goodbye to your hero." With a final surge of strength, Jason pushed through the pain, his love for Vivian overpowering the profiler's control. His hand shook, but he steadied it, pointing his gun at Michael, his eyes full of anger. "You'll never control me again." Michael's eyes widened, but before he could react, Jason pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, and Michael fell back, dead before he hit the floor. But there was no time to waste. Footsteps thundered toward them, the guards closing in. Daniel, holding his own injuries, helped Jessica toward the back exit. But Jason suddenly stopped, gripping his head as the mind control fought back, pulling him under. He screamed, glancing at Vivian, Jessica, and Daniel, all battered and desperate to escape. He knew he couldn't let this continue. If he escaped, he'd be a threat to them all. This had to end here. With a steadying breath, he turned toward the hallway that led to the main control room, the heart of the profiler's mind control operation. He knew what he had to do. "Vivian, go," Jason managed, his voice raw with pain. "I'm ending this." "No," Vivian cried, reaching for him. "Jason, don't. Please. There has to be another way." But Daniel held her back, understanding Jason's plan. Jason looked at Vivian one last time, his face soft despite the pain. "I love you, Vivian," he said quietly. Before anyone could stop him, he ran down the hall toward the control room. Bursting inside, he grabbed the chip on his neck and yanked it free, ignoring the blinding pain. He looked around at the machines, the core of the profiler's work. With one final breath, Jason activated the chip's detonation sequence. The explosion tore through the facility, destroying everything: plans, equipment, and any hope the profilers had. Jason's last thought was of Vivian, the woman he loved, as the blast ended his nightmare and their control in one powerful flash. Outside, Vivian's scream cut through the night as the shockwave hit. She dropped to her knees, her heart breaking at Jason's sacrifice, a loss that saved them all but left her shattered. Years later, after a long business meeting, Vivian sat on the steps of what had once been a thriving corporate building, now reduced to ashes. The air still carried the scent of burnt metal and smoke, remnants of the battle that had cost her so much. The explosion that took Jason's life had also shattered something inside her, leaving a hollow, aching void that words couldn't fill. But she didn't allow Jason's death to be in vain. His sacrifice had to mean something. Vivian devoted her life to honoring his memory. She created the Jason Reed Foundation for Ethical Science, funding research to help people and prevent mind control abuses. Through the foundation, Vivian also wanted to inspire young scientists to see the importance of ethics in their work. Jason's story, his life, and his ultimate sacrifice would be at the heart of this mission. Every person who walked through the doors of the foundation would know what he gave up for the freedom of others. Working with Daniel, she exposed the profiler's crimes, leading to public outrage and global investigations. Vivian also published a book on Jason's life, courage, and love, inspiring countless readers. She built a memorial at the explosion site and offered support to other victims. In Jason's name, she completed their drug formula under strict ethical use and advocated for international regulations to prevent future mind control abuses. Jason's legacy became a global symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of love. Whenever Vivian spoke of Jason, she did so with a heart full of love, knowing that even in his final moments, he had given the world something it could never repay: the freedom to choose. He was gone, but his legacy lived on, stronger than ever. The end.